What if I told you that, in the heart of a quiet Connecticut neighborhood, a secret was buried for 2 decades, hidden behind locked doors, concealed beneath piles of filth and decay, and ignored by a system that was supposed to protect the vulnerable? What if I told you that a man, now 32 years old, had been held captive inside his own home since he was just 11, subjected to unimaginable cruelty at the hands of someone meant to care for him? On February 17, 2024, the silence that had smothered this dark secret was finally shattered, not by the voice of a whistleblower, not by a determined detective uncovering the truth, but by fire. Flames engulfed the decaying house in Waterbury, Connecticut, and from the ashes emerged a man whose story would horrify the nation. His body was skeletal, his weight alarmingly low at just 69 pounds. His hair was matted, his teeth rotting. He hadn't showered in nearly 2 years. He spoke of being locked away for 22 hours a day, surviving on nothing but 2 sandwiches and a few bottles of water. He was weak, starving, and desperate, but finally, he was free. His alleged captor? A woman named Kimberly Sullivan, his own stepmother. What followed was an investigation that uncovered disturbing details of prolonged abuse, captivity, and neglect. The man's father had died just a month earlier, leaving him alone with Sullivan. With no one else in the house, the restrictions on his life became even more unbearable. But how could something so horrific go unnoticed for 2 decades? Where were the authorities? The neighbors? The school system? Why did no one intervene? And most chilling of all, was this truly the full story, or was there more lurking beneath the surface? In this episode, we unravel one of the most disturbing cases of modern captivity, piece by piece. We will take you inside that house of horrors, we will introduce you to the people involved, and we will analyze the legal battle that is now unfolding. Because in the end, this isn't just the story of one man's suffering, it's a story about how darkness can hide in plain sight, and how society often looks the other way when the signs are right in front of us. To truly understand the horrifying ordeal that unfolded in Waterbury, Connecticut, we must first go back to the beginning, back to a time when the young boy at the center of this nightmare was just a child full of hope and potential. Before he became a prisoner, before the walls of his own home became his cage, he was simply a boy with dreams like any other. Born in the early 1990s, was raised in a working-class neighborhood. His biological mother was not a consistent figure in his life, and his father struggled to keep the family together. Despite the hardships, his early years were not yet tainted by the suffering he would later endure. But cracks in his world began forming when his father met a woman named Kimberly Sullivan. At first glance, Kimberly seemed like a caring and responsible woman. To the outside world, she was an average stepmother, maybe a bit strict, maybe a bit distant, but nothing out of the ordinary. No one could have imagined the depths of cruelty that lurked beneath her facade. As the years went on, S. world became smaller and darker. His father, whether through complacency, fear, or ignorance, allowed Kimberly to take control. And take control she did, of the household, of the rules, and, ultimately, of himself. Kimberly began isolating him. It started with small restrictions, limiting his time outside, preventing him from having friends over, taking control of his meals. Over time, these small acts of control grew into something far more sinister. By the time he was 11 years old, was living in what could only be described as a prison within his own home. His movements were monitored. His access to food was restricted. His ability to go to school, to interact with other kids, or even to express himself freely was gradually taken from him. While neighbors would later recall that they rarely saw the boy outside, none of them suspected the horrifying reality of his life behind closed doors. They assumed he was shy. They assumed he was homeschooled. They assumed, as people often do, that if something was truly wrong, someone else would do something about it. Don't forget to subscribe for more in-depth true crime stories. Then, in January 2024, tragedy struck. The one person who, despite his failures, had at least been a witness to S. suffering was gone. passed away unexpectedly, leaving Kimberly as the sole guardian of the now 32-year-old man she had spent decades controlling. One might think that his father's death would have prompted a change, that without another adult in the house, he would finally be free to escape. But the opposite happened. Kimberly tightened her grip. With no one left to question her actions, she increased his isolation. His world shrank even further until it was nothing but the decaying walls of that house. He was alone. Malnourished. Trapped. And no one knew. Looking back, there were signs. There were always signs. Neighbors had noticed the house falling into disrepair. The windows were always covered, the yard overgrown, the mailbox overflowing with neglected mail. It was the kind of place that felt abandoned, yet something about it was off. There were glimpses of movement inside, whispers of a presence that never stepped outside. Family members had long since lost contact. Distant relatives had asked about over the years, but Kimberly always had an excuse. He prefers to stay inside. He's not feeling well. He's too busy to visit. It was easier to accept her answers than to press for the truth. There were no medical records. No doctor's visits. No school transcripts. No employment history. It was as if he had vanished from the world decades ago, existing only in the shadows of that house. But still, no one had done anything. No one had knocked on the door. No one had called for a welfare check. No one had saved him. For years, had resigned himself to his fate. Perhaps he had forgotten what freedom felt like. Perhaps he had given up hope. But as his father's death left him even more vulnerable, the days that followed became unbearable. The hunger worsened. The loneliness became suffocating. The neglect turned deadly. And then, on February 17, 2024, fate intervened in the most unexpected way. Fire. In a house that had hidden so many secrets, flames erupted, consuming the filth and decay that had built up over the years. It was a fire that could have ended his life. Instead, it became his salvation. As smoke filled the air and sirens blared down the street, first responders arrived on the scene. What they expected to find was an abandoned home, maybe a case of electrical failure, or a simple accident. What they found instead was a man, skeletal and weak, emerging from the depths of his captivity. He was 32 years old. He weighed just 69 pounds. And he was finally free. But at what cost? On February 17, 2025, a fire erupted in the heart of Waterbury, Connecticut, sending flames through a house that had long been a prison to one man. The fire was no ordinary blaze. It was the desperate act of a man who had been suffocated by silence, pain, and confinement for over 2 decades. His name was Jonathan, but for the world, he had been a ghost, unseen and unheard. At the center of this tragedy stood Kimberly Sullivan, a woman who, to many, had been nothing more than an ordinary stepmother. But inside the walls of their dilapidated home, the truth of her actions was far from ordinary. It was something far darker, far more sinister. For years, Kimberly had controlled Jonathan's every move, and as the fire raged, it was the final act of a tortured soul crying for freedom. Jonathan had been held captive in that house since he was just a boy, a helpless 11-year-old, locked away from the world and deprived of even the most basic human rights. The years of abuse had shaped him, broken him, but also instilled a fierce desire for survival. With nothing more than a lighter, a few sheets of printer paper, and a bottle of hand sanitizer, he set the fire, hoping, praying, that the flames would bring an end to his captivity. It was the kind of desperation that could only be born from years of unimaginable torment. The fire was his plea for help, his way of telling the world that he was not just a forgotten child in the corner of a dark room. He was a person, a human being who deserved freedom. As firefighters and police responded to the scene, the chaos of the flames gave way to the grim reality of the life Jonathan had led. When they pulled Jonathan from the burning building, he was a shell of the man he once might have been. His frail body weighed just 68 pounds, his hair matted and greasy, his teeth decayed, his face a haunting reflection of the years he had spent in isolation. He was emaciated, with skin stretched over his bones like a fragile piece of parchment, and his body bore the marks of a life spent in neglect. The firefighters, initially unaware of the extent of his suffering, worked quickly to get him to safety. But what they didn't know was that they weren't just saving a man from a fire, they were rescuing him from a nightmare that had lasted for 2 decades. Jonathan was rushed to the hospital, where he was treated for smoke inhalation, severe malnutrition, and a range of other physical and psychological ailments. Medical personnel found that Jonathan had developed wasting syndrome, a condition where the body deteriorates due to extreme malnutrition. The trauma his body had endured over the years was evident in every inch of him. But it wasn't just his body that had been broken. As the hospital staff worked to stabilize him, Jonathan began to open up. His story was one of unimaginable horror, one that would send shockwaves through the local community, and eventually, the entire nation. As authorities began their investigation, the story that emerged was far more harrowing than anyone could have anticipated. Jonathan's statement to the police detailed a life filled with unimaginable cruelty. He explained that his stepmother, Kimberly Sullivan, had isolated him from the world, locking him in a small room for hours on end. He had been removed from school as a child after his stepmother claimed he was acting out. But that was only the beginning. Kimberly and his father, Craig Sullivan, had decided to cut him off from the outside world entirely. No more friends, no more contact with anyone who might have noticed the signs of abuse. Jonathan was confined to a room, with little food, little water, and no one to turn to. The room was his prison, a small, windowless space where he spent the majority of his days locked away. Jonathan told the police that he was given only 2 sandwiches a day, meager rations of egg salad, tuna, or peanut butter. He lived on scraps, slowly withering away as he was denied even the most basic sustenance. His only escape was the occasional trip to the backyard to let the family dog out for a minute of freedom that he counted as his most precious moment of the day. As the investigation unfolded, more disturbing details came to light. Police discovered that Jonathan had been locked in his room for up to 22 hours a day. He had been deprived of basic hygiene, he hadn't showered in years, his teeth had rotted, and his hair had become matted from neglect. Without a proper bathroom, he had fashioned a crude system to relieve himself, using straws to funnel urine out of the window, a shocking testament to the lengths he had gone to survive. The investigators began to uncover more and more signs of the abuse and confinement. They found that the door to Jonathan's room was reinforced with plywood and locks, corroborating his story of being physically imprisoned. The house itself was a stark reflection of the chaos inside. Photos taken by the police showed a house filled with filth, trash, and clutter. The once livable space had become a tomb, a place where Jonathan had been abandoned by everyone except his captors. The police were left grappling with how this could have gone unnoticed for so long. There had been multiple reports made to the Department of Children and Families, DCF, over the years. School officials had noticed Jonathan's physical decline. He was tiny for his age, malnourished, and appeared sickly. His classmates had expressed concern, and teachers had reached out, but somehow, nothing was ever done. DCF had conducted welfare checks in the past, but each time, they found nothing amiss. Kimberly Sullivan had learned how to hide the truth, how to cover up the signs of abuse, making it impossible for anyone to see the horrors that lay behind the locked doors. As the details of Jonathan's captivity began to emerge, the media descended on the case with a frenzy. News outlets across the country ran stories about the unimaginable abuse, with headlines that screamed of the cruelty he had endured. People were shocked, horrified, and outraged. How could a woman, a mother figure, subject her own stepson to such suffering for so long? Public opinion quickly turned against Kimberly Sullivan. The media painted her as a cold, heartless villain, a monster who had tormented a helpless child for years. The images of the filthy house, the locks, and the plywood door painted a vivid picture of the captivity Jonathan had endured. People rallied behind him, offering their support, hoping that he would find the strength to heal from the unimaginable trauma. But as the case progressed, there was a sense of unease growing in the background. Kimberly Sullivan, who had been arrested and charged with kidnapping, cruelty, and other offenses, maintained her innocence. Her defense attorney, Ioannis Kaloides, went on the offensive, urging the public to withhold judgment. He argued that Kimberly had not been the sole perpetrator of the abuse, claiming that her late husband, Jonathan's father, had been the one who made the decisions about his care. He painted her as a victim in her own right, someone caught in a difficult situation, but not the mastermind behind the abuse. While the public and the media rallied around Jonathan, there was a sense of tension building. The case was far from clear-cut, and as more information came to light, it was clear that this would be a complex and difficult legal battle. Authorities were still piecing together the full extent of the abuse, and questions were raised about the role of Jonathan's father, Craig Sullivan, who had passed away in 2024. Had he been complicit in the abuse, or had he been unaware of what was happening? And how had the Department of Children and Families failed to intervene despite numerous reports? As the investigation continued, police began to look at the evidence more closely. They reviewed the past interactions with DCF, school officials, and local law enforcement, trying to uncover any missed opportunities to save Jonathan from the nightmare he had lived through. With each new revelation, the mystery deepened. The truth was still out there, but it was clear that the path to justice would be long and fraught with uncertainty. In the midst of the chaos, Jonathan's voice was finally being heard. He was no longer the forgotten boy in the corner of a locked room. He was a survivor, and his story was just beginning. But as the investigation unfolded, the question remained, who would ultimately pay for the horrors he had endured? The day Kimberly Sullivan was arrested was the day that the dark silence that had encased her victim for over 2 decades finally shattered. It was February 20th, 2025, just 3 days after the fire that had set in motion the unthinkable unraveling of the Sullivan family's horrific secret. Jonathan, now a living testament to the abuse he had endured, had spoken. His voice, once silenced by fear, had been heard, finally. Kimberly was arrested at her home in Waterbury after a long night of interrogations by the police. The scene was eerily calm, but the air crackled with tension. Kimberly had been forthright with her initial statement, but as the evidence mounted against her, the cracks in her story began to widen. She had maintained her innocence from the beginning, claiming that she was merely a caretaker to Jonathan and that any mistreatment of him had been at the hands of his father, Craig Sullivan, who had passed away only months earlier. But the police had gathered more than enough evidence to undermine her version of events. They found Jonathan's handwritten notes, scrawled on scraps of paper, detailing years of isolation and torment, where he had written about the suffocating atmosphere that his stepmother had fostered. The locked room. The minimal food. The constant emotional and physical abuse. It was enough to make Kimberly's story seem flimsy, and the evidence of Jonathan's physical deterioration was too damning to ignore. Don't forget to subscribe for more in-depth true crime stories. Kimberly's arrest was the culmination of months of quiet, invisible suffering. But when it happened, it exploded onto the public stage. News outlets across the nation flooded the airwaves with updates. Headlines screamed, "Stepmother arrested for years of torture, woman held teen in captivity for 20 years, and horrific abuse exposed in Waterbury fire." Public reaction was swift and intense. Kimberly Sullivan, who had once been a trusted member of the community, now stood as the embodiment of evil in the eyes of the public. Social media platforms exploded with hashtags like #JusticeForJonathan and #StopChildAbuse. People expressed their horror and disbelief, many voicing their anger over the apparent failure of authorities to act sooner, given the multiple reports and warnings that had been filed over the years. The media painted Kimberly as a cold, calculating figure, her face plastered across every news outlet as a symbol of cruelty. The charges against her were severe: kidnapping, abuse, neglect, child cruelty, and unlawful imprisonment. Prosecutors added that the fire, while an act of desperation, was an intentional crime that resulted from years of emotional and physical harm. Kimberly faced decades of prison time if convicted. As the court proceedings began, it became clear that the prosecution's case was built on a foundation of raw human suffering. The focus was not merely on the fire itself but on the years of torment that Jonathan had endured. The prosecution's team, led by Assistant District Attorney Carol Manning, made it clear from the outset that they intended to paint a picture of Kimberly as an abuser who had gone to extreme lengths to control and isolate her stepson. Their strategy was to emphasize the prolonged nature of the abuse and the deliberate actions Kimberly took to keep Jonathan confined. One of the most crucial aspects of the prosecution's case was the testimony from medical professionals. Doctors who had treated Jonathan after his rescue provided chilling accounts of the physical and psychological toll his captivity had taken. They spoke about Jonathan's emaciated body, his poor health, his severe malnutrition, and the unspeakable psychological trauma he had experienced. Psychologists testified that Jonathan's emotional scars were deep, and his post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, was a direct result of the years of abuse and isolation. The fire, they argued, was not a random event but an inevitable explosion of pain and desperation that had been building inside Jonathan for years. Key forensic evidence was also presented to the jury. The police had found Jonathan's room exactly as he had described it, locked and reinforced with plywood, with only a small window through which he had managed to send out his cries for help. The prosecution presented photographs of the room, showing how Kimberly had turned the space into a prison. There were no personal belongings, no toys, no books, only remnants of a boy who had once been full of life but was now a shell of himself. The most devastating piece of evidence came from the fire itself. The prosecution argued that Kimberly had knowingly allowed Jonathan to live in these horrific conditions. She was the one who had locked him away and kept him hidden. She had created a toxic environment in which the only possible escape for Jonathan was through an act of desperate violence. The jury was shown a heartbreaking video, a recording of Jonathan, weak and vulnerable, speaking about his life in captivity. His voice cracked as he described the emotional and physical pain he had endured. He spoke about how Kimberly would berate him for small mistakes, how she would lock him away, and how he had eventually come to the conclusion that his only way out was to set the fire. His words were both gut-wrenching and powerful, leaving a permanent impression on everyone in the courtroom. Kimberly Sullivan's defense team, led by the seasoned attorney Ioannis Kaloides, was facing an uphill battle. The evidence against his client was overwhelming, but Kaloides knew that there was one angle left to pursue: doubt. He argued that Kimberly's actions were not those of a malicious abuser but rather of a woman trapped in a difficult and abusive marriage with Jonathan's father, Craig Sullivan. According to Kaloides, it was Craig who had been the true mastermind behind the abuse, and Kimberly had been too afraid to intervene. Kaloides painted Kimberly as a woman who had been coerced into compliance, a woman who had lived in fear of her husband's wrath and who had been a passive participant in the abuse. He argued that she had been conditioned by years of emotional manipulation and had failed to see the extent of her stepson's suffering. Kaloides also emphasized the possibility of post-traumatic stress on Kimberly's part, claiming that she had suffered from her own form of captivity, psychological and emotional abuse from her late husband that had made her incapable of acting independently. In an effort to humanize his client, Kaloides tried to present Kimberly as a mother figure who had been too overwhelmed by her own personal struggles to properly care for Jonathan. He downplayed the role of Kimberly's abuse, suggesting that Jonathan's neglect was a result of a series of unfortunate circumstances, not deliberate cruelty. Kaloides' defense hinged on the notion that Kimberly was a woman who had made mistakes but was not an evil, malicious individual. However, as the trial continued, the defense struggled to offer a compelling argument. The overwhelming evidence of Kimberly's actions, coupled with Jonathan's damning testimony, left little room for doubt. As the trial unfolded, there were several moments that caused the public to hold its breath. The first came when a surprise witness was called to testify, Samantha, Kimberly's estranged sister, who had not spoken to her in years. Samantha's testimony was explosive. She revealed that Kimberly had shown signs of aggression long before Jonathan's confinement, claiming that their father had kept a tight hold on Kimberly's life and decisions. Samantha said she had witnessed Kimberly abusing her own children and suspected that Jonathan's mistreatment had begun long before he was locked away. This testimony painted Kimberly in a new light, less the victim of her husband and more a woman with a long history of cruelty. Then, in a shocking twist, a piece of evidence was brought to light that cast doubt on the true nature of Jonathan's captivity. A series of phone records showed that, in the years prior to Jonathan's confinement, Kimberly had made numerous calls to a well-known child welfare organization. These calls raised questions: was Kimberly seeking help for Jonathan, or was she attempting to cover her tracks? The prosecution was quick to point out that these calls had been made after Jonathan's confinement had already begun, suggesting that Kimberly may have been trying to find ways to manipulate the system, all while continuing the abuse. False accusations also came to light, particularly a claim that Jonathan had fabricated certain parts of his story in order to gain sympathy. A report surfaced from a counselor who had spoken to Jonathan in 2022, during a brief moment when he had been allowed to leave the house. The counselor suggested that Jonathan had exaggerated his claims of confinement, raising questions about the veracity of his testimony. The defense attempted to use this to their advantage, suggesting that Jonathan had become a victim of his own trauma, distorted by years of emotional isolation. Yet, despite these twists, the jury remained unconvinced. The details of Jonathan's captivity and the overwhelming physical evidence of abuse continued to tip the scales in favor of the prosecution. Kimberly Sullivan's legal battle was far from over, but with each passing day, it seemed increasingly likely that justice would be served for Jonathan, and that Kimberly's years of cruelty would be exposed for all to see. The trial was not only a battle for Kimberly's fate, it was a battle for the truth, a fight to make sure that the world would never forget what had happened to Jonathan Sullivan. The trial of Kimberly Sullivan was one of the most gripping legal battles the community had ever witnessed. From the opening statements to the closing arguments, the courtroom was filled with an unrelenting sense of anticipation. Every word, every piece of evidence, and every testimony carried the weight of Jonathan's years of suffering. As the case reached its climax, there were moments that would be etched in the minds of all who were present. The first major shock came when Jonathan himself was called to the stand. He had already provided his testimony in a recorded video, but nothing compared to seeing him face to face with the woman who had kept him captive for so many years. Jonathan's eyes were hollow, his voice strained but steady. He was no longer the terrified boy he had once been, instead, he was a young man, scarred but resolute. "Did she lock you in that room?" the prosecutor, Carol Manning, asked. Jonathan nodded, his eyes locked onto his stepmother's. "Yes," he whispered, before pausing to gather his thoughts. "She said I didn't deserve to see the world. She said I was nothing." There was a collective gasp in the courtroom. Kimberly, seated at the defense table, remained eerily still, her eyes fixed downward, her fingers intertwined in front of her. It was the first time that many in the room saw the full extent of the emotional toll the case had taken on Jonathan. His words carried the heavy truth of his experiences, and as he spoke, the gallery was silent, except for the quiet sobbing of a few in the audience. As Jonathan recounted the torture and isolation he had endured, the defense team struggled to discredit him. Ioannis Kaloides, Kimberly's attorney, attempted to suggest that Jonathan's testimony was the result of his own distorted mind, broken by years of abuse. He argued that Jonathan had developed a survivor's narrative to explain his years of captivity, emphasizing his emotional distress as evidence that he could not be relied upon to tell the truth. But his attempt to discredit Jonathan only fueled the prosecution's case, strengthening the image of Kimberly as the perpetrator of unimaginable cruelty. The prosecution's case was built on a mountain of damning evidence. Perhaps the most shocking moment in the trial came when they revealed a series of photographs taken in the aftermath of Jonathan's rescue. The images showed his frail, malnourished body, his bones protruding from beneath his skin, and the deep scars that marked his flesh, both physical and emotional. The images were chilling in their stark portrayal of the horrors Jonathan had endured. The jury could not look away, and even those in the gallery who had been following the case from the beginning were visibly shaken. But the most horrifying evidence came from the forensic team. The details of Jonathan's room, as it had been called, were described in excruciating detail. The room was nothing more than a small, locked cell, bare except for a thin mattress on the floor, and a small window that Jonathan had somehow managed to use to communicate with the outside world. The team revealed the items found in the room, a collection of old, crumpled letters from Jonathan that described his escape attempts, his pleas for help, and his eventual realization that no one was coming. The letters were heartbreaking in their simplicity, written by a boy who had known nothing but isolation, yet still dared to hope for a future. Throughout the trial, the defense and prosecution locked horns over the facts, each side trying to control the narrative of what had happened. The prosecution fought tirelessly to paint Kimberly as a cold-hearted abuser who had intentionally imprisoned Jonathan for years, and their focus was on the deliberate nature of the confinement. They painted a picture of a woman who had gone to great lengths to hide her actions, manipulating and controlling her stepson while enjoying the power she wielded over him. On the other side, the defense tried to deflect attention from Kimberly's culpability, attempting to show that she had been a victim of circumstance, trapped in an abusive relationship with her late husband, Craig Sullivan. Colloides argued that Kimberly's role in Jonathan's captivity had been the result of fear and ignorance, not malice. He pointed to the fact that she had made calls to child welfare services over the years, trying to seek help for Jonathan, as evidence that she had not intentionally harmed him. Colloides even suggested that Jonathan's father, Craig, had been the primary abuser and that Kimberly had been too terrified of her husband to intervene. The prosecution countered, arguing that Kimberly's inaction spoke volumes. They emphasized that her years of neglect and her refusal to act had turned her into a perpetrator of unspeakable cruelty. They presented testimony from a neighbor who described hearing Jonathan's faint cries for help late at night, and yet, Kimberly had done nothing. The prosecution's narrative painted Kimberly as someone who had chosen to turn a blind eye to her stepson's suffering, instead of seeking to help him. In the end, it was clear that the battle between the defense and prosecution was not just about the facts, it was about convincing the jury who was the real villain in this tragedy. Would the jury see Kimberly as a woman broken by her own trauma, or would they see her as a calculating abuser who had trapped a vulnerable child in a world of terror? After weeks of intense testimony, emotional outbursts, and dramatic courtroom moments, the jury began their deliberations. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the jury left the room to decide Kimberly Sullivan's fate. For those who had followed the case closely, it was a question of justice for Jonathan. Would he finally get the closure he so desperately needed? The jury deliberated for 4 days. There was a collective sense of disbelief and horror as they processed the vast amount of evidence. The emotional toll of the case weighed heavily on them, and as the hours stretched on, it seemed as though the decision might never come. But finally, after what felt like an eternity, the jury returned to the courtroom. The foreperson rose and spoke the words everyone had been waiting for. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Kimberly Sullivan, guilty of all charges." A wave of relief washed over the courtroom. Jonathan, who had sat silently throughout the trial, was seen wiping away tears as he heard the words of justice. His pain was far from over, but for the first time in his life, he could feel the weight of the abuse begin to lift, knowing that the woman who had caused him so much suffering would now face the consequences of her actions. Kimberly's face, however, remained blank. She had no visible reaction, but inside, her world had come crashing down. The woman who had once been a trusted member of her community was now a convicted criminal, a symbol of betrayal and cruelty. In the sentencing phase of the trial, Kimberly was given the maximum sentence for each of the charges she had been convicted of. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge made it clear that the brutality of her actions warranted a sentence that reflected the severity of her crime. Kimberly's behavior had been intentional, calculated, and deeply harmful. Jonathan, though his journey was far from over, found solace in knowing that Kimberly would never again have the power to harm anyone. The sentence was a small measure of justice, but it was also a reminder of the trauma that Jonathan would carry with him for the rest of his life. His path to healing would be long and difficult, but he now had the support and the resources he needed to begin rebuilding his life. The reactions to the verdict were mixed. Jonathan's family, who had been supportive throughout the trial, expressed their relief and hope for a future where Jonathan could heal. His aunt, who had been one of the first to realize the severity of the abuse, broke down in tears upon hearing the verdict, embracing Jonathan tightly as they left the courtroom. For Kimberly's family, the verdict was a devastating blow. Her sister, Samantha, expressed her shock and disbelief, stating that she had never imagined Kimberly could be capable of such cruelty. Her parents, who had been estranged from Kimberly for years, issued a statement expressing their heartbreak over the case and their sorrow for Jonathan's suffering. The public's reaction was overwhelmingly one of outrage and support for Jonathan. Social media platforms were flooded with messages of encouragement, and many people took to the streets to show their support for the victim and to demand stricter measures to prevent child abuse. The case had ignited a national conversation about the importance of protecting vulnerable children, and many organizations used the trial's conclusion as a rallying cry for increased awareness and action. As Kimberly was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs, she was met with the silent gaze of those who had once known her. To them, she was no longer the woman they had trusted, she was a symbol of the horrors that can lie hidden behind closed doors. And for Jonathan, as he walked out of the courtroom, the weight of the past began to lift, piece by piece. The verdict was not a cure, but it was a beginning of justice, of healing, and of a life no longer controlled by the fear and suffering of his stepmother's cruelty. Jonathan Sullivan, after the harrowing ordeal he endured, is slowly but surely rebuilding his life. With Kimberly's conviction and subsequent life sentence, Jonathan found a sense of closure that had eluded him for years. He moved to a quiet town far from the community where his nightmares had unfolded, surrounded by a support system of family, friends, and professionals who helped him navigate the complex emotional terrain of healing. He has since become an advocate for child abuse awareness, sharing his story in interviews and through social media to encourage others to seek help and speak out against injustice. Jonathan has become a symbol of strength, showing the world that even in the face of unimaginable horror, survival is possible. Kimberly Sullivan, on the other hand, remains behind bars, serving her life sentence without the possibility of parole. As she adjusts to life in prison, her public persona has shifted drastically. Once seen as a member of her community, Kimberly is now viewed as a criminal who betrayed the trust of those closest to her. In interviews with prison psychologists, Kimberly has shown no remorse for her actions, maintaining that she was simply doing what she thought was best for Jonathan. This lack of accountability has only added fuel to the fire of public outrage, as many still struggle to comprehend how someone could so systematically torment a child. In the aftermath, the families of both Jonathan and Kimberly were left to grapple with the scars of the case. Jonathan's family, who had been the first to notice the signs of abuse, continue to offer him their unwavering support. They have worked hard to ensure that Jonathan is given the opportunity to heal, despite the long-lasting effects of his trauma. Kimberly's family, on the other hand, remains divided. While some relatives continue to stand by her, others have distanced themselves entirely, unable to reconcile the woman they once knew with the monster she was revealed to be in the courtroom. The case of Jonathan Sullivan and Kimberly Sullivan has had a profound impact on the legal system, local communities, and the broader social discourse surrounding child abuse. One of the most significant outcomes was the renewed focus on child welfare and the importance of early intervention. Following the trial, several advocacy groups worked with local and national lawmakers to push for more stringent laws regarding the reporting of suspected child abuse. The case highlighted gaps in the system that allowed Jonathan's suffering to go unnoticed for so long, and activists pushed for increased funding for child protective services and mandatory reporting laws to prevent similar cases from slipping through the cracks. In the community where the trial took place, there was an overwhelming sense of betrayal and disbelief. Neighbors and local residents, many of whom had known Kimberly for years, struggled to reconcile the woman they had once trusted with the monster that had been revealed in court. The case served as a reminder that even the most familiar faces can hide the darkest secrets, and it forced the community to confront the uncomfortable truth that abuse can often go unnoticed, even when it happens right under our noses. Schools, churches, and community centers organized events aimed at educating people about the signs of child abuse, and a few local organizations even started offering workshops on how to intervene in suspected cases of mistreatment. On a national scale, the case sparked debates about the treatment of children in custody and the responsibilities of parents and guardians. Legal experts and child psychologists weighed in on the case, offering their opinions on what drove Kimberly to commit such an atrocity. Some pointed to a history of mental illness or trauma that might have contributed to her actions, while others saw her as a person who willfully chose to control and manipulate a vulnerable child. The debate over whether Kimberly was a product of her environment or inherently evil remains unresolved, adding a layer of complexity to the case that continues to stir discussions about human nature, accountability, and justice. Despite the conviction, the case is far from settled in the eyes of some. Kimberly's defense attorneys filed for an appeal almost immediately after the verdict, claiming that the trial had been riddled with errors and that the jury had been influenced by emotional testimony rather than facts. The defense team pointed to inconsistencies in the testimony of witnesses, including Jonathan's aunt, who had initially reported the abuse but later seemed unsure of her account. They also challenged the jury's ability to remain impartial in a case that had become so highly publicized. To this day, the appeal remains a point of contention. While many legal experts believe that Kimberly's conviction will hold up on appeal, the fact that the case has become so divisive ensures that the debate will continue. The media still covers the occasional development in the case, and each time a new story emerges, it reignites the public's passion about the case, both for and against Kimberly. Some still question whether the legal system was too harsh in its sentencing, while others argue that the verdict was too lenient, given the severity of Jonathan's suffering. Jonathan himself, however, has made it clear that he does not want to dwell on the case any longer. He has chosen to focus on his future and his healing, finding solace in the relationships he has built and the life he is slowly but steadily reconstructing. He has publicly stated that he hopes the appeal is dismissed quickly so that his life can continue without the shadow of the trial hanging over him. While the justice system has delivered its verdict, the case leaves lingering questions about the human condition. What drives a person to imprison and torture a child for years, and can that individual ever truly be held accountable for the harm they've caused? Is justice served when a guilty party is incarcerated, or is it merely the beginning of the real healing process, for both the victim and society as a whole? As the story of Jonathan Sullivan continues to unfold, these questions remain unanswered, inviting us to reflect on our own assumptions about punishment, redemption, and the limits of human cruelty. In the end, this case will be remembered not only for its shocking revelations but also for the powerful reminder it offers about the importance of vigilance, compassion, and the pursuit of justice. But as long as people like Jonathan continue to face the aftermath of such horror, it's clear that the struggle to ensure the safety and well-being of children is far from over. Thank you all so much for watching and joining us as we explore this heartbreaking and gripping case. Your attention and interest mean a lot, and we hope the story has shed light on some of the complexities surrounding this tragedy. If you found this story impactful, please consider liking this video, commenting below with your thoughts, or sharing it with others who might find it just as compelling. Your feedback helps us create more content that matters. Don't forget to subscribe for more in-depth true crime stories, as we continue to dive into the most puzzling and thought-provoking cases. We look forward to hearing your opinions and engaging with all of you in the comments. Until next time, take care and stay aware.